Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out the new GeForce RTX 4060 Ti, though I should specify that we're covering the 8GB version, not the 16GB model that's now set to arrive in July, and really that should be the only model. But I think the 16GB version, I'll talk about this more later in the video, may have been a bit of an afterthought. Certainly a lot of you agree that that was the case based on a poll that we've done, but I mean, speaking to that, there's no real indication here that, well, first of all, these are 8GB graphics cards, and that's going to make it difficult when you're when you're just looking at the box and trying to work out, is this the 8GB version or the 16GB version? So there is a small little 8GB label on the side of this box, but on the front, yeah, I can't see one unless I'm missing it, and certainly can't see one here either. So anyway, probably that does suggest that maybe the 16GB version was a bit of an afterthought and a reaction to all of your pushback against these 8GB graphics cards in 2023. Anyway, I think an 8GB graphics card for $400 US is complete and utter garbage. It is laughably bad. So strap yourself in as we rip Nvidia's new RTX 4060 Ti, a new one. But before we do, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Skytech Gaming, a provider of pre-built gaming PCs in California. They offer lifetime technical support backed by well-trained customer support, and all their systems feature a 1-year parts warranty. One of their newest pre-builts is the Azure 2, which Skytech Gaming sent over for us to check out. This is a well put together PC that looks great, the BIOS has been tuned for optimal cooling and noise performance, and the cable management is extremely neat. It features the new GeForce RTX 4070 along with the Core i5-13600K, and this allows it to deliver impressive mid-range performance, while supporting all the latest and greatest features such as DLSS 3 frame generation, ray tracing, and AV1 encoding. So, to get the right PC built for you, check out the link in the video description. Okay, so for now I can refer to this graphics card simply as the 4060 Ti, but in the not too distant future we will have to identify if we're talking about and testing the 4060 Ti 8GB or 4060 Ti 16GB, so that is going to be a lot of fun. Now I'm not going to bore you with the full rundown of all the specifications as we've already covered all that information last week in Tim's RTX 4060 series announcement video. So I'm going to assume that if you care about all of that stuff, you've already watched Tim's video, or you're willing to go back and check it out. There really is quite a lot to discuss here, namely VRAM capacity, and I will get into that in greater detail towards the end of the video. We'll have a look at some examples and just discuss that. But obviously, this is a major problem with the RTX 4060 Ti, as it only packs 8GB of VRAM, and yet Nvidia still think they can charge $400 US. And yeah, there will be a 16GB model, but it's set to cost even more at $500 US, which is problematic in on itself. Frankly, we don't really even need to test the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB to tell you it's a disgustingly poor value product and just a horribly disappointing release from Nvidia. In short, Nvidia is claiming RTX 3070-like performance for a $100 discount, which would be great if they solved the most glaring issue with the RTX 3070 in modern games, and that of course being its very limited VRAM buffer. I can't really be clear enough on this point. There should only be a single RTX 4060 Ti, and it should have 16GB of VRAM, just no exceptions there. Oh, and it certainly shouldn't cost $500 US. At most $400 US for a 16GB version of the 4060 Ti. I think that's probably acceptable. Sadly though, Nvidia has missed the mark here by at least $100 US. Anyway, keeping that in mind, let's go over the benchmark data, check out some cost per frame stuff, and then we will form our conclusion. For testing, the CPU used is the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, which has been paired with the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. I've tested at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, though we will of course focus on the 1080p and 1440p data for this review, as those are more realistic use cases for this 8GB GPU. All of this data is fresh and updated for this review, so let's get into it. Okay, first up we have Fortnite using the more optimal DirectX 11 mode, but the visual quality settings have been maxed out, which ideally isn't how you'd play even in a semi-competitive setting, but since we're testing GPU performance, I think the Epic settings make sense. At 1080p, the 4060 Ti rendered 130 FPS, making it just 6% faster than the 3060 Ti, which I have to say is super disappointing, and that meant it was 3% slower than the RTX 3070. The 1440p data is even more disappointing. Here the 4060 Ti only managed to match the 3060 Ti, making it 12% slower than the 3070. And I believe the issue here is the narrow 128-bit wide memory bus, whereas the 3060 Ti has a 256-bit wide bus, resulting in a 56% increase in memory bandwidth. Nvidia does claim that the larger L2 cache boosts the 4060 Ti's effective bandwidth to 554 gigabytes per second, which is a 24% increase over the 3060 Ti, but we're certainly not seeing evidence of that here, as the 4060 Ti certainly looks to be memory bandwidth limited. Next up, we have Resident Evil 4, and the 1080p results do look more promising using the Prioritize Graphics Quality preset, which doesn't enable ray tracing. Here, the 4060 Ti was good for 135 FPS, so that's a 5% boost over the RTX 3070, and then 14% over the 3060 Ti. So that's certainly a better result, but 14% over the 3060 Ti at the same price with the same VRAM capacity, it doesn't exactly have me jumping out of my seat. Then, as we increase the resolution to 1440p, the 4060 Ti can only match the 3070, though it was still 14% faster than the 3060 Ti, but again, it's not exactly amazing progress after 2 years or so. A Plague Tale Requiem has more mediocre performance for us at 1080p. Here the 4060 Ti managed 91 FPS, making it a few frames slower than the 3070 and just 6% faster than the 3060 Ti. Then, as we've already seen a few times now, that larger L2 cache really isn't making up for the much narrower memory bus, as Nvidia claims. I'm sure it does help, but not enough at 1440p, as here the 4060 Ti only managed to match the old 3060 Ti, which I'm sure I don't have to tell you is a super disappointing and even depressing result. F122 does enable ray tracing by default using the ultra-high preset, and as I've said a number of times in the past, this halves performance and just isn't worth the visual upgrade, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, we've tested the game using the default settings, and here we found that the 4060 Ti is just a few frames faster than the RTX 3070, and we're still just 8% faster than the 3060 Ti, so it's unlikely that ray tracing performance will be more impressive relative to those similarly priced previous generation GeForce parts. And then we see the 1440p margins, they're much the same. Here it's 6% faster than the 3070 and 11% faster than the 3060 Ti. So I guess decent performance overall, but also seriously underwhelming at the $400 US price point in mid-2023. Next up, we have Cyberpunk 2077 with more of the same. The 4060 Ti roughly matched the RTX 3070, it was slightly slower, and it did provide just single-digit gains over the 3060 Ti. Also, as we've typically come to expect at this point, the 4060 Ti does perform worse at 1440p, at least relative to those previous generation GPUs. It performed closer to the 3060 Ti than it did the 3070, which again is just an awful result. Dying Light 2 sees the 4060 Ti delivering RTX 3070-like performance at 1080p with 101 FPS, so a 10% boost over the 3060 Ti. But again, as we increase the resolution to 1440p, the 4060 Ti becomes more like a 3060 Ti, offering a mere 3% performance increase, so basically an indistinguishable difference here. Watch Dogs Legion appears to be sort of a best case result for the 4060 Ti, allowing it to outperform the 3070 by a 5% margin at 1080p, and that meant it was 15% faster than the 3060 Ti, which seems decent based on what we've seen so far, but really it's not. Then at 1440p, the 4060 Ti can only match the 3070, making it just 11% faster than the 3060 Ti. Actually, I think Forza Horizon 5 looks to be a best case result, as here the 4060 Ti was 11% faster than the 3070 and 23% faster than the 3060 Ti, which realistically, I think should probably be a minimum increase. But sadly, that's certainly not the case. Then at 1440p, the margins once again come down. Now it is just 7% faster than the 3070 and 18% faster than the 3060 Ti, which is hardly cause for celebration. The Total War Warhammer III results at 1080p, well, they suck to put it bluntly, as here the 4060 Ti was only 6% faster than the 3060 Ti, making it 4% slower than the RTX 3070. Then at 1440p we are looking at 3060 Ti performance, so Nvidia's really going to be working pretty hard to sell you on the frame generation technology, as there's really not much else on offer here. The Spider-Man Remaster results are, as you'd expect, really more of the same. The 1080p results see the 4060 Ti come in a few frames slower than the 3070, and just 6% faster than the 3060 Ti. Then at 1440p, it's just 4% faster than the 3060 Ti, so basically the same level of performance for the same price with the same amount of VRAM, so that's just awesome. Hogwarts Legacy is very heavy on memory bandwidth, even without ray tracing enabled, and this is a problem for the 4060 Ti, and it meant at 1080p it trailed the 3060 Ti by a 5% margin, and the 3070 by a 12% margin. Of course, things only got worse at 1440p. I see the 4060 Ti was 11% slower than the 3060 Ti, and 14% slower than the 3070. It even lost out to the 6700 XT. The Halo Infinite results were better, but even so, at 1080p we're only looking at 3070-like performance for a small 15% bump over the 3060 Ti. It did maintain that margin at 1440p, suggesting that Halo isn't particularly memory bandwidth sensitive, but still, RTX 3070-like performance isn't amazing given the price and specifications. Here we have the results based on the latest version of The Last of Us Part 1, which addresses VRAM usage, and while it does improve the situation, it still highlights the limitations of pairing high-end graphics cards, or what are relatively high-end graphics cards with just 8GB of VRAM. Even at 1080p, we're seeing worse 1% low results on the 8GB models, and this has impacted the 4060 Ti. But it's at 1440p with the ultra settings that completely cripple the 8GB cards, and this of course includes the 4060 Ti, so that is certainly a concern, not just for what we're seeing here, but for future games. And sure, you could lower the texture quality settings, but the fact that we can quite clearly demonstrate a VRAM limitation under playable conditions is unprecedented for a new GPU review, and will surely spell disaster for future AAA games. And moving on to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, we find that the 4060 Ti is good for 121 FPS at 1080p, making it 9% faster than the RTX 3070 and 21% faster than the 3060 Ti, so a half-decent gain there. This time though, as we increase the resolution, the margins do remain much the same, and this sees the 4060 Ti 8% faster than the 3070 and 20% faster than the 3060 Ti. Finally, we have Hitman 3, and here we're looking at RTX 3070-like performance at 1440p with 140 FPS on average, so an 11% boost from the 3060 Ti. Then we find much the same at 1440p, 11% over the 3060 Ti to match the 3070, so more underwhelming performance. Now just quickly, here's a look at power consumption, or total system power consumption, with the 4060 Ti, and it did push total system usage to 273 watts in Hitman 3, which is a good result given it matched the performance of the RTX 3070, allowing for an almost 30% reduction in total system usage. The 4060 Ti also sat between the 3060 Ti and 3070 in Spider-Man Remastered, and it pushed total system usage to 255 watts, which is a 33% reduction when compared to the 3070. So it is certainly a very efficient GPU. Okay, so here's a quick look at the average performance seen across the 15 games tested, starting with the 1080p data. As you would have guessed, based on what we just saw, the 4060 Ti is basically an RTX 3070, at least at 1080p, making it just 8% faster than the 6700 XT and 9% faster than the 3060 Ti. Then at 1440p, it slips just behind the RTX 3070, basically sitting between it and the RTX 3060 Ti. But we're talking about just a 5% boost over the 3060 Ti, which is obviously a terrible result for the new 4060 Ti. Then finally, just for reference sake, here's the 4K numbers. On average, the 4060 Ti was good for just 38 FPS, suggesting that it's not really cut out for 4K gaming, at least not without heavily dialed down quality settings. Okay, so first we're going to take a look at the suggested retail pricing, and please relax, we will get to typical retail pricing in a moment. I just find it useful to analyze MSRPs as well, and we see when doing so the 4060 Ti is technically the best value product of this roundup, but it's also still massively underwhelming. At 1440p, which I believe to be a more suitable resolution for this cost analysis, given that we are talking about a $400 US product, the 4060 Ti improves upon the 3060 Ti's value by a mere 2.5%. The 3060 Ti arrived during December of 2020, so it is a 2.5-year-old product at this stage, and what this means is, after 2.5 years, Nvidia has moved the needle forward in terms of cost per frame by 5%. That's it. And worse still, you're getting the same amount of VRAM, so they're relying entirely on improved efficiency, AV1 encoding, and DLSS 3 frame generation to sell you on a 4060 Ti, and that's simply not going to cut it, at least not for those of you with a 3060 or 3060 Ti. But of course, the picture gets much worse when we look at current retail pricing, so let's go do that. Yeah, look, this is pretty brutal. Brutally poor value for gamers, that is. There's basically no reason to buy the 4060 Ti. It is effectively dead on arrival, at least at $400. And really, if you wanted this level of performance, you could have achieved it for less money anytime over the past 6 to 12 months with products like the Radeon RX 6700 XT. Admittedly though, there's not much here from Nvidia that competes, but again, if you managed to buy an RTX 3060 Ti 2.5 years ago at the MSRP, which I suppose very few people did given the cryptocurrency boom, but if you did, you'd be sitting here scratching your head wondering why the 4060 Ti even exists. Frankly, if you want to buy or need to buy a graphics card right now, the 6700 XT looks to be a much better deal, at least while stock lasts. Not only is it 13% cheaper and just 5% slower on average, but it packs an extra 4GB of VRAM, ensuring that VRAM capacity won't be an issue for a much longer period of time. It's also not great for Nvidia that the 6950 XT offers slightly better price to performance with twice as much VRAM, so that's pretty crazy to see there from the previous generation flagship, but again, those prices are, well, they've been discounted and there will be limited time only deals until stock dries up, which I think for the 6950 XT, it's probably not that far away. Now, for those of you wondering, here's what we believe the 4060 Ti should cost, or at least the absolute maximum price Nvidia should be charging for this product. So $300 US. At this price, it would be almost a 20% discount from the 6700 XT, which does have more VRAM, and an almost 30% improvement over the 3060 Ti, which is a more typical and I'd say expected generational improvement. Sadly though, it's not the case, and that means you absolutely shouldn't buy an RTX 4060 Ti for $400 US. Okay, so given how efficient the RTX 4060 Ti is, you won't be surprised to learn that the little Founders Edition card is very cool and quiet, maxing out with a die temperature of just 62 degrees at a fan speed of 1500 RPM, which does sound quite fast, but the card itself was extremely quiet and could barely be heard over our case fans, which are already very quiet to begin with. So when it comes to the design and operation of Nvidia's Founders Edition model, we have no complaints. That said though, for an even cooler and quieter experience, the MSI Gaming X Trio version of the RTX 4060 Ti would be the way to go. This model peaked at just 53 degrees after an hour of stress testing, and despite that, the fans were spinning at just 1100 RPM, which is remarkable. Of course, MSI's Gaming X Trio is a much larger graphics card with a huge heatsink and triple fan cooler attached to a very small PCB. I do like how MSI has gone with a single 8-pin power connector though. This just makes a lot more sense for lower end graphics cards in my opinion. Okay, so here's the latest version of The Last of Us Part 1 at 1440p using the ultra quality preset. And as you can see, frame time performance, frame time consistency, not very good on the RTX 4060 Ti. Performance is all over the place here, a lot of stuttering and really bad 1% lows, which is what you saw in the graphs earlier on. Now, if we enable DLSS, that seems to mitigate the stuttering issues we saw due to the lack of VRAM earlier. There is the odd small frame hitch here and there in the scene that we're testing, but I would say performance overall is satisfactory. But of course, this may not be true for all areas of the game. This is only a very short test. Now, previously, Resident Evil 4 would crash when using the maximum quality settings on an 8GB graphics card, but that's no longer the case. However, we are again seeing horrible frame stuttering. This is seen quite consistently throughout the area of the game that we test with. So again, you'll be seeing 1% lows that are very low, and again, a lot of frame stuttering. Now, the Callisto Protocol could be quite a difficult game for benchmarkers to find the VRAM issues because, for the most part, you can run a series of benchmark passes and not actually exceed the VRAM buffer, as it does take quite a while to build up. Well, not an excessive amount of time, around a minute, which is generally how long most benchmarks run for, but for the majority of that benchmark pass, the frame time performance could be quite good, like what we're seeing here. And here we are playing at just 1080p, so low resolution, though we are using the ultra quality settings. But they're quality settings that you could probably expect to use in a game that's already been released on a brand new $400 US graphics card. And yeah, we do have ray tracing enabled, but again, if you're buying a new GeForce GPU, especially if you're paying $400, you probably want to be able to enable ray tracing in pre-existing games, especially at 1080p. And we're doing that here, and performance seems pretty good. You know, not the best frame time graph I've ever seen, but it's not terrible, at least not yet. And now you can start to see some pretty horrible frame stuttering kick in. The 1% lows are diving. It's bringing the average frame rate down as well. And then, yeah, the game just completely, well, it doesn't crash, but, well, you've got 1% lows of almost single digits at this point, just horrific frame stuttering. And of course, the game is now unplayable. So you're not going to be playing this game on any 8GB graphics card using these quality settings at 1080p, which is very disappointing, obviously. Now, if we lower the quality settings to high, remaining at 1080p with ray tracing enabled, the game's pretty playable. Frame time graph probably isn't as smooth as you'd like to see on a new $400 graphics card, but it is playable, so you only have to dial down the quality setting one notch to get playable performance. Now, A Plague Tale Requiem, 1080p Ultra with RT enabled. We've seen that this game can be playable on GPUs with similar performance to the 4060 Ti, but with only 8GB of VRAM, that's just not happening. Basically unplayable here. We've got single-digit 1% lows with less than 20 FPS on average once we run out of VRAM, which happens almost instantly. And as I got to this section of the game coming up right about here, yep, I thought the game had actually crashed because that can happen when you exceed the VRAM buffer, but no, it was just having a break. Bit of a rest. And yeah, now we'll move on to test with the high quality settings. And I thought that this was actually going to work. So the frame time graph, yeah, again, not perfect, but certainly a lot better. Again, 1080p, high quality settings, ray tracing enabled, and the game's very playable. We're getting up around 70 FPS at this point, and I thought this would work just fine, but then I got to here and quite a huge frame stutter. Thought perhaps that was just a one-off, so I continued doing a bit more testing, but unfortunately, no, that wasn't a one-off. The game basically isn't stable under these test conditions, which you'll get another glimpse of that in a moment. Just walking up here, and I think I paused for a second to look around. From memory, yep, and there you go, another huge frame stutter, and then another one again, so they'll just continue. There's not quite enough VRAM. Now this is interesting. For Spoken using the ultra high quality settings, which do enable playable frame rates on something like an RTX 4060 Ti, we find that the game doesn't suffer from, well, performance related issues. There's no stuttering, at least the section of the game I tested. Frame rates are quite good. The problem is the game just looks like crap. Textures aren't loading, and I found this interesting. They've updated the game, whereas the textures didn't load at all previously. They now seem to swap from areas. So if I look up and then look down, you can see the floor textures are terrible, and then they improve. And sometimes they pop in and out, which is what we saw in Hogwarts Legacy, a game I'm not going to bother covering here. But yeah, if I look at the ground, the textures eventually load in and it looks reasonably good. This is a sort of a dull looking area of the game, so visually it looks a bit off, but you can see the ground there has rendered correctly. But anyway, this is one of the issues you can run into when you don't have enough VRAM. Games just look off. And speaking of which, we'll move on to Halo Infinite using the ultra quality settings at various resolutions. So if I turn the resolution right down, you can see this shrub here, this little bush. It's loaded with a bit more detail. The rock has now, I believe that's the correct resolution for the rock. The trees don't look quite right, but they're certainly better. Now, if we go back into the settings, increase the resolution up to 1080p, we see that the shrub still looks pretty low resolution. It's obviously not going to improve as we increase the VRAM requirements. And you see the tree there still looks pretty awful. The rock is still loading, I believe, in with the correct textures. But then if we increase the resolution again up to, say, 1440p or thereabouts, with the little resolution scaler, we see that the shrub looks okay there. Well, it looks like how it looked. Not okay, but it looked the same as what we saw at the lower resolutions. But if we walk away from it and come back, You can see now it's struggling to fill all the textures in. The rock texture looks worse. The trees now have lost detail and are just sort of more of a blurry mess. So basically 8GB of VRAM is just not enough for this game. So there you have it. As far as buying advice goes, as I've already said, absolutely do not buy this thing for $400 US. It is laughably bad at that price. Look, if it had 16GB of VRAM for $400 US, then I think it would be okay. Let me know what you think about that in the comments, of course. But yeah, I don't think it'd be amazing, but not unbelievably horrible either. As I've just shown, $300 US is the absolute maximum amount of money Nvidia should be able to charge for an 8GB RTX 4060 Ti. And the 16GB version, which should be the only version in my opinion, well, that should cost at most $350 US. But I could probably get on board at around $400 US. And certainly let me know what you think about those prices for a 16GB version of this graphics card. And it seems pretty clear to me, though I should preface this by saying that this is pure speculation on my behalf, but it does appear as though Nvidia never really intended to release a 16GB version of the RTX 4060 Ti, which might explain why it's been delayed by a few months. I'd say late last year when Nvidia was working out the GeForce 40 series product stack, they only had plans for an 8GB 4060 Ti class product for around $400 US, though the pricing would have been penciled in much more recently. But my point is, I believe the intention was to only arm the 4060 series with 8GB of VRAM, which makes sense given that the 4070 series has 12GB. But with a number of recently released games causing issues for 8GB cards, such as the RTX 3070, and we of course have dedicated videos to pointing this out, and the enthusiast crowd has pushed back against Nvidia's apparent stubbornness to give gamers more VRAM, Nvidia were forced to rethink plans, just as they did last year with the what they called unlaunching of the 12GB 4080, which eventually became the 4070 Ti. Anyway, as I said, this is pure speculation on my behalf, and of course Nvidia will never let us know the truth, but ultimately it doesn't really matter. In the end, they're doing their absolute best to push overpriced 8GB GPUs on gamers, and we here at Hardware Unboxed are simply not going to stand for it. Now, a week prior to this review, we had a private briefing with Nvidia, and as expected, the topic of VRAM did come up. Nvidia employees tried to justify why the 4060 Ti has an 8GB VRAM buffer at $400 US, and they also tried to explain why this doesn't actually matter, and they did this while simultaneously speaking of the advantages of the 16GB model, which doesn't really make sense, but I do feel for the Nvidia employees trying to justify these products. That can't be an easy job, given the recent evidence of high-end 8GB GPUs kind of crapping the bed. But Nvidia's primary argument seemed to be that most gamers have an 8GB graphics card, and therefore game developers have to cater to them. They can't simply leave the majority of gamers behind, or their game is destined to flop. This is the same argument I've seen a lot of Nvidia fans make, and I'll be perfectly blunt, it's an absolutely crap argument, and for Nvidia fans, it's certainly not one that any gamer should actually make. Firstly, yeah, it's true, the majority of gamers do use an 8GB graphics card, as evident by the Steam hardware survey, and really that's not a surprising statistic, but it does highlight a major problem that's been largely caused by Nvidia, and to some extent AMD. Nvidia's basically admitting that they've been holding back the market with mainstream 8GB graphics cards for far too long, causing headaches for developers and limiting the progress of game development. It's also a crap argument because we've heard from a number of game developers now who have said they're fed up with these VRAM limitations, and future AAA titles based on new game engines will be moving forward to take advantage of 16GB, 20GB and larger frame buffers when using ultra quality settings, relegating any GPU with an 8GB buffer to 1080p medium or possibly even low quality settings. So those games are still going to work on an RTX 4060 Ti, you just won't be getting anywhere near a premium PC experience. Rather, you'll probably end up with an inferior visual experience to that of a modern console, which is a truly depressing thought for those of you faced with having to spend $400 US on an RTX 4060 Ti. In the end, we had quite a lengthy discussion with the Nvidia employees. Essentially, they claimed that 8GB of VRAM is mostly fine for 1080p gaming, And I should probably emphasize that Nvidia's positioning the 4060 Ti 8GB graphics card as a 1080p gaming product, which we find absurd at the $400 price point. In any case, they did claim that it's mostly fine, but also admitted that in some instances it will be a compromised experience that will require gamers to dial down certain quality settings, which again we find unacceptable at 1080p, given the price. It was also a bit of an odd discussion where Nvidia's employees claimed that 8GB is fine for the RTX 4060 Ti, but also believed that spending $100 US more for the exact same GPU with 16GB of memory was a good idea. I guess they're admitting that the 8GB version is gimped, limiting it to a mostly okay 1080p experience in today's games, but for gamers who wish to enjoy the RTX 4060 Ti without memory limitations, so gaming at 1440p for example, spending $100 more for that privilege is also fine. They're also hesitant to answer our questions about future games and speak to the longevity of 8GB GPUs such as the RTX 4060 Ti. Basically, they admitted that VRAM requirements will continue to increase, and that 8GB 4060 Ti owners will just have to be prepared to dial down quality settings in the future where need be. And this is something that could also be avoided by spending $100 more on the 16GB model. Of course, there's really no other way to answer that question without inevitably shooting yourself in the foot. Obviously, game development will continue to progress, and like smaller VRAM capacities that came before it, 8GB will become obsolete at some point. And while that day is likely still some time away, it's clearly going the way of the dodo at the high end. Anyway, I think the point that's really worth hitting home here is that never before have we reviewed a brand new current generation GPU, especially a mid-range GPU, and have been able to highlight so many scenarios which should be playable had the product been given enough VRAM. And clearly, this is a big problem for the 8GB RTX 4060 Ti, and it's $400 US asking price. Finally, we're not going to dive into detailed ray tracing performance for this review, and there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, the card doesn't really have enough VRAM for acceptable RT performance, and we highly doubt support for future AAA titles is going to be acceptable, at least for some of them. Also, performance really won't be that different to the RTX 3060 Ti and RTX 3070, so if you're familiar with their RT performance, you'll be up to speed with what the 4060 Ti is capable of there. I'll probably look more at RT performance for this product when we get a Radeon competitor, as that comparison will make a lot more sense. Then we have DLSS 3 frame generation, a feature Nvidia has heavily pushed on reviewers for this generation, especially with the 4060 series, suggesting that we focus on that feature for our reviews. Now, as I've noted in the past, a big issue with DLSS 3 benchmarks is reporting frame generation as an FPS metric, as 120 FPS, for example, using DLSS 3 frame generation really isn't 120 FPS. It's the smoothness of 120 FPS with the input of roughly half that frame rate, with the potential for a few graphical issues. And this is really a serious issue for those benchmarking with frame generation enabled and displaying that data on graphs, for example, and we suggest any reviewer benchmarking with frame generation enabled should report those numbers as something like 120 DLSS 3.0 FPS, something that makes it very clear that they're generated frames and not rendered frames that include input. And for this reason, we're just not going to show DLSS 3 results that way, as it's best thought of as a smoothing technology, not necessarily an FPS booster, as technically, that's not exactly what it's doing. Also, frame generation doesn't solve VRAM issues, so it's not going to solve the performance-related issues we found with this graphics card. And that's going to end what's turned out to be an excessively long review of a product we strongly recommend you don't purchase, at least not for $400 US. Maybe $300, but certainly not $400. And as I've noted in previous VRAM-related content, the goal here is to inform gamers and raise awareness, hopefully forcing Nvidia to give you more VRAM, and that will allow game developers to make better-looking games. And I think the 16GB RTX 4060 Ti is some evidence that this is working, so keep letting Nvidia and AMD know that you're no longer going to stand for overpriced 8GB graphics cards, and perhaps the GeForce 50 series won't suck. And that is going to do it for this review. Hopefully you guys appreciated this content, enjoyed the video. It was a lot of work, and yeah, obviously we're getting a lot of pushback and hate for our stance on 8GB graphics cards, especially, you know, high-end cards. I think we've tried to make that clear that we're not saying all 8GB cards are obsolete or that all graphics cards need more than 8GB of VRAM, but I think when you're spending $400, yeah, and then $500 is a bit of an insult to get 16GB. Not sure what Nvidia were thinking there, and based on feedback we've seen from you guys, not well received. So basically our stance is to, really no one should oppose our stance, anyone outside of, say, Nvidia and AMD. I think we should be all on the same page that 8GB is now holding back game development, holding back the progress of the gaming industry. We want PC to be the superior platform, really, don't we? We want it to, you buy these high-end graphics cards, you want them to look a lot better than consoles. You want it to be a really premium experience, especially when you're paying a premium. Anyway, I won't go on about that. I'm sure this will come up many more times in Q&A series and stuff like that, but it is a bit frustrating to see quite a few people defending 3070 Ti's and probably this product as well. It really should have had 16GB of VRAM, and of course the 4070 series should have had more memory as well. But anyway, enough of that topic for now. I'm just going to move on, or I'm just going to try to move on. Yeah, video's over. Don't buy it. Wait for prices to drop, and hopefully they do. I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.